Effective immediately, Simone Reyes is no longer president of Cross Capital Group. The words hit the marble lobby of the Cross Capital Tower like a dropped tray of glass. Simone stood in the middle of the atrium, a badge reader in her hand that had just flashed red instead of green, security guards flanking her on either side like she was a shoplifter instead of the woman who'd built half this company from a card table in a rented office 14 years ago. Her husband, Julian Cross, stood at the top of the grand staircase in the $2,000 suit she'd picked out for him, microphone in hand. Cameras from 3 local business outlets pointed up at him like he was announcing an IPO instead of ending a marriage in front of 40 employees. "Any comment, Mrs. Cross?" a reporter called out, angling for her reaction. Simone didn't answer. She pulled her phone from her coat pocket, thumbed it open without shaking, and dialed a number she'd known by heart for 9 years. Dahlia Monroe picked up on the first ring. "Simone." "Fire every single one of them," Simone said, her voice flat, almost gentle, like she was ordering coffee. "Every name on the list." There was a pause on the line, not surprise, just the quiet of someone who had been waiting months to hear exactly those words. "Understood," Dahlia said, already moving. Simone slid the phone back into her pocket, looked up at her husband one last time, turned, and walked out through the revolving doors into the gray Chicago morning like she had somewhere far more important to be, because she did. Before you find out exactly what Simone Reyes had built behind her husband's back for 11 months, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. This story gets darker, and you will not want to miss what happens next. Simone Reyes was 41 years old, and until 11 months ago, she believed marriage meant building something side by side, brick by brick, where both names mattered equally on the deed. She was wrong about the equally part. She was right about everything else. Rewind 2 years. Simone met Julian Cross at a venture capital mixer in a hotel ballroom that smelled like champagne and ambition. He was smart, charming, hungry in the specific way that men who grew up watching money slip through other people's hands are hungry. She had already built Reyes Analytics into a respected boutique data firm by then, 60 employees, 3 offices, a reputation that meant something in rooms full of people who didn't hand out reputations easily. Julian had an idea and no capital. Simone had capital and 15 years of operational discipline. They merged the companies. They merged their lives 18 months later at a courthouse in Lake County with 2 witnesses and a bottle of grocery store champagne, because neither of them believed in spending money on a party when there was a company to build. "We are partners," Julian told her the morning they signed the merger papers, his hand over hers on the conference table. 50-50, nothing happens without both of us. She believed him. That belief cost her almost everything. The first crack came quietly, the way most betrayals do, disguised as generosity. Julian's mother, Adele Cross, started showing up at the office twice a week with homemade banana bread and a habit of asking pointed questions about who really runs the finance side these days. Adele had raised Julian alone after his father walked out when he was 9, and she had a particular philosophy about money that Simone only fully understood much later. Control it, or someone will take it from you, the way it was taken from her. Adele's nephew, Preston Cross, started appearing at company events not long after. Preston had failed at 2 startups and a real estate license before Julian quietly created a special projects role for him in procurement, a title vague enough to hide almost anything. "He's family, Simone," Julian said when she raised an eyebrow at the hire. "Family looks out for family. You know how hard it is for someone like him to catch a real break." She let it go. That was her first mistake, though she wouldn't recognize it as a mistake for another year. Small discrepancies started appearing in the quarterly numbers about 14 months before that morning in the lobby. A consulting invoice here, $12,000, routed through a company called Meridian Advisory Partners that Simone had never heard of despite personally approving every vendor contract for the past decade. Then another. Then 3 more, each small enough to miss if you weren't the kind of person who read every line of every report before signing off, which Simone was. She didn't say anything right away. She had learned a long time ago that the moment you speak too early, people simply get better at hiding. 14 months before the lobby, on a Friday night after the office had emptied out, Simone sat alone at her desk with a legal pad and a cup of coffee gone cold, tracing Meridian Advisory Partners back through 2 layers of LLC filings to a registered agent address that matched, almost exactly, Adele Cross's condo in Winnetka. She sat with that for a long time, not rage, something quieter and heavier, like watching a slow leak spread across a ceiling you'd spent years keeping dry. She called Dahlia Monroe into her office that night. Dahlia had been her executive assistant since Reyes Analytics had 11 employees and a single rented floor. She was the only person, besides Simone's late father, who had ever fully understood what building this company had actually cost her. "I need you to start keeping records," Simone told her quietly. "Everything, dated, backed up in 2 places off the company servers." Dahlia didn't ask why, she just nodded. "How far back do you want me to go?" "As far as it takes." What Simone and Dahlia built over the following 11 months wasn't revenge, not at first. It was documentation. A private drive, encrypted, containing every inflated Meridian invoice cross-referenced against real vendor pricing. Recovered emails between Julian and Preston discussing what they called the transition once the divorce filing went through. A folder of internal memos showing Preston quietly being groomed to take over operations Simone had spent a decade perfecting. All of it sitting in a locked drive that nobody in the Cross family knew existed. 10 months before the lobby, Simone found something that made her hands go cold in a way the invoices never had. A signed restructuring agreement transferring a controlling share of Reyes Analytics' original intellectual property, the algorithms she had built with her own hands before Julian ever entered her life, into a new holding entity controlled by Julian and Adele. Her signature at the bottom, a signature she had never made. She sat with that paper on her kitchen counter until nearly 2 in the morning. Forgery isn't a small word. It isn't a misunderstanding you talk through over dinner. It's a decision someone makes deliberately, believing you'll never look closely enough to catch it. "I'm not going to let them walk away with what I built like it was never mine," she whispered to the empty kitchen, to nobody, to herself. That was the night Simone Reyes stopped being a woman waiting for her marriage to get better and became a woman building a case. 1 or 2 no in between. Comment 1 if you think Simone should have confronted Julian the moment she found that forged signature, or comment 2 if staying quiet and building the case first was the smarter move. I want to see where you land, because it's about to matter a lot. 2 days after the lobby, with rain streaking the windows of her downtown condo, Adele Cross showed up at Simone's door carrying a foil pan of banana bread and an apology nobody had asked for. Simone almost didn't answer. She's glad she did, because what happened in the next 15 minutes told her more than 11 months of invoices ever could. "Simone, honey," Adele said, standing on the threshold, mascara smudged faintly at the corners of her eyes. Whether from the rain or something real, Simone genuinely couldn't tell. "I'm not here to fight. I just need you to release the escrow account before the end of the month. There's a loan payment tied to some of the Meridian contracts, and if those funds stay frozen, it's going to be a real problem for everybody." Standing there, Simone realized her husband had almost certainly known about this visit before Adele ever knocked. Nothing in that family moved without Adele signing off first. Maybe it never had. "Once this settles," Adele went on, "Julian's going to liquidate some of the legacy IP holdings and everybody walks away clean. It doesn't have to be ugly. We are still family." Then Adele said the sentence Simone would remember for the rest of her life, delivered with a small, almost pitying laugh. "You were never the visionary here, sweetheart. You were the operator. Somebody had to keep the trains running while the real ideas came from somewhere else." Simone understood, standing on that porch, that Adele wasn't really asking for money. She was asking Simone to stay small, to accept a story where 15 years of building something from nothing got rewritten as bookkeeping. "You call it family," Simone said quietly, reaching into her coat pocket to switch on a small recorder Dahlia had given her weeks earlier. "But you're trying to take the one thing I built before Julian ever walked into my life." Adele's face changed just slightly, just enough. "Nobody's taking anything that isn't already halfway gone. You signed papers, Simone. You made choices." "I never signed away my company's IP to a holding company with your name buried 3 layers deep in the filing," Simone said. "I signed a merger agreement believing it meant partnership." Adele didn't answer that. She picked her purse back up, told Simone to think it over, and walked back to her car, leaving the banana bread on the porch table, untouched, going soft in the rain. 5 days after the lobby, Simone called an emergency meeting of the board, not to fight, but to finish what 11 months of quiet work had prepared her for. The boardroom on the 31st floor had floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the Chicago River, the kind of view that used to make Simone proud every single morning she walked in. That day, the sky was gray and low, rain streaking the glass, and the room felt colder than the thermostat could explain. Julian sat at the head of the table in a charcoal suit, jaw tight, phone gripped in one hand like it might steady him. Adele sat beside him, her practiced warmth pulled tight over something closer to fear. Preston lounged 2 seats down, sunglasses pushed up on his head, wearing the confidence of a man who believed this meeting would go exactly the way the lobby announcement had. Simone walked in 5 minutes late. She didn't sit in the chairman's seat. Julian had already given that to himself months earlier, though the board had never formally voted on it. She stood at the back with Dahlia beside her, holding a thin folder and a flash drive. Julian started the meeting exactly the way he'd clearly rehearsed it. "Today, we'll be formalizing the operational transition and finalizing the restructuring that reflects the company's current direction going forward." "Before anyone votes on anything," Simone said, her voice even, carrying easily across the quiet room, "I think everyone should see a few documents." Dahlia plugged in the drive. The screen filled with the first image, real vendor invoices laid side by side against the padded Meridian Advisory Partners invoices, the gap between them totaling just under $2.1 million over 11 months. Then came the recovered emails, conversations between Julian and Preston discussing the transition weeks before the divorce filing had even been submitted. Then the document that made the room go completely silent. A scanned copy of the restructuring agreement transferring Simone's original IP into the new holding entity. Her signature at the bottom, forged, next to Julian's, which was real. Simone looked directly at her husband. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I built that algorithm alone in a rented office 3 years before I ever met you, Julian. You forged my name onto a transfer of the one thing in this company that was mine before it was ever ours." For the first time since she'd known him, Julian had nothing to say. Then Marcus Way, the company's controller, a man Julian had trusted completely, a man Simone had quietly asked to help Dahlia 18 months earlier, stood up on his own. "Everything on that screen is accurate," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the tremble in his hands. "I've been documenting the discrepancies since Ms. Reyes first asked me to look into the Meridian contracts. It's all here." Adele's composure cracked in a way Simone had never seen. "Simone, we can fix this quietly. We can still." "You had 11 months to fix it quietly," Simone said. "You chose to fire me in a lobby full of cameras instead. Watch what happens next." Do you think Simone handled that boardroom with too much restraint or exactly the right amount of control? Drop your answer in the comments, because what happened in the next 11 minutes decided everything. The room stayed silent a long moment after Marcus sat back down. Julian tried once more, his voice smaller now, stripped of the boardroom polish he usually wore like armor. "Simone, you can't do this to me. We had something real." Looking at him in that moment, Simone finally understood something about her husband that 2 years of marriage hadn't taught her as clearly as 11 minutes of watching him lose everything did. Julian had never learned how to want to be loved. He had only learned how to want to be ahead. Somewhere between his mother's lean years and his own rise, being in control had quietly replaced being close as the thing that made him feel safe. "We did have something real," Simone said. "You're the one who chose to end it by bringing your family in to take what was never theirs to take." The board didn't need long to deliberate. 11 minutes by Simone's watch. 11 minutes to unwind 11 months of quiet infiltration. The vote was nearly unanimous. Preston was removed from his position immediately, along with two other cross-family placements who had been quietly installed in finance over the preceding year. Julian was stripped of his CEO title effective that afternoon, pending a full independent audit and consultation with outside counsel regarding the forged transfer document. Simone was reinstated as president and chairwoman, a position she had never legitimately lost since the board had never actually voted her out. Her original founder's shares, structured specifically years earlier to prevent exactly this kind of takeover, meant the outcome was never truly in question once the truth was on the table. Julian and Adele were asked to vacate the building within 24 hours. Simone didn't feel triumphant walking to the window and looking out over the river, the rain still falling in that same steady rhythm it had been all morning. She felt tired, the specific tiredness that comes after carrying something heavy for a very long time and finally setting it down. Behind her, she heard Adele's composure finally break completely, not into anger, but into something quieter and sadder, a kind of muttering to herself. All of this over a few contracts. As if the scale of what she'd tried to take could somehow be minimized by saying it's small enough. Dahlia stepped up beside Simone at the window, careful to keep some distance the way she always did, professional, steady, present without ever intruding. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly. "I'm okay," Simone said, "just tired from staying quiet for a long time." If this story has you hooked, do me a favor right now and smash that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and tell me in the comments what you think happens to Julian next. It genuinely helps this channel more than you know. 3 days later, security escorted Preston out with a single box of belongings, mostly protein shakes, and a framed photo of himself at a launch event he'd attended for exactly 6 weeks. Julian stopped at the elevator bank, and for a moment Simone thought he might turn around. He didn't. The doors closed on his reflection in the polished steel, a man standing very small in a very large lobby he used to walk through like he owned every inch of it. Adele lingered longest, gathering a few things from a desk drawer she'd claimed as her own over the past year. Watching her move slower than anyone else toward the door, Simone thought unwillingly of something Julian had told her once, that his mother had been left with nothing after his father walked out, and had sworn her family would never depend on anyone else's mercy again. It didn't excuse what Adele had done, but it helped Simone understand the hunger behind it, and that understanding made it easier to let her go without hatting her for it. In the weeks that followed, Simone focused on something other than the wreckage. She focused on repair. She found Priya, a senior analyst who had been quietly overlooked for promotion for 3 years under Julian's leadership, and moved her into the operations director role she had earned twice over. She corrected retroactive pay for 2 engineers who had been underpaid relative to their tenure since the merger. There was no press conference, no public statement calling anyone out by name. Dahlia drafted a short professional release for local business outlets. Reyes Analytics reaffirms its founder-led leadership and commitment to transparency following an internal governance review. That was all it needed to say. The people who mattered already knew the truth. Real justice, Simone had learned slowly over many years of being underestimated, rarely looks like the movies. It doesn't come with a courtroom gasp or a dramatic reveal set to swelling music. Sometimes it just looks like paperwork done correctly and people who lied finally having to live with what the truth costs. That first week, Simone slept better than she had in over a year. Not because everything was resolved, the divorce proceedings still had months left to run, and there would be legal follow-up on the forged documents for a while yet. She slept better because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't carrying a secret. Everyone who needed to know now knew. Have you ever had to quietly rebuild something after someone you trusted tried to take it from you. Tell me how you found your footing again. I read every single comment. 2 months later, on a quiet Saturday afternoon, Simone sat across from her younger sister, Nadia, on the patio of a small cafe near the lake, the kind of late spring Chicago afternoon where the wind still carries a little winter in it. Nadia had flown in the week everything happened and never quite left. "How come you're not angrier?" Nadia asked, stirring her coffee slowly. "I would have burned the whole company down." Simone thought about how to answer that for a long moment. "Because being angry doesn't build anything," she said. "I was angry for a while, hurt for longer than I probably let myself admit. But if I'd spent all my energy hatting Julian, I wouldn't have had anything left to rebuild the company or to keep the one thing that was always mine before he ever came into the picture. So I chose something different. I chose to protect what mattered by staying quiet, gathering what was true, and acting only when it actually counted." Nadia nodded slowly. "That sounds like it was hard." "It was," Simone said. "It still is, some days, but it's a lot easier than carrying hate around for the rest of your life." Nadia was quiet for a moment, watching the water. "Do you think Julian ever actually loved you, or was it always about the company?" Simone turned her cup slowly on the table before answering. "I think he loved the version of me that made him feel safe, the version that never needed anything back. The moment I stopped being convenient, I stopped being anything to him at all. That's not love, Nadia. That's just a very patient kind of using." "That's a hard thing to carry," Nadia said quietly. "It was," Simone said, "but I'd rather carry the truth than keep pretending I didn't see it. I saw it for a long time before I let myself say it out loud." That evening, Simone stood alone on the balcony of her condo as the sun dropped low over the skyline, gold light settling across the river the same way it had settled there 100 evenings before, back when she still believed partnership meant something sturdier than what it turned out to be. She thought about how many nights she'd stood on balconies like this one, waiting for a wire transfer to clear, waiting for a phone call, waiting for someone to finally see what she'd carried. This time, standing there, she wasn't waiting for anything. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she was simply present, and that, it turned out, was its own kind of arrival. This story is a reminder that legacy was never about the size of the company or the number on a settlement. It's the version of yourself you can still recognize once everyone who claimed to love you has finished telling you who to be instead. If someone in your own life ever uses the word family to ask for something that costs you more than it costs them, don't answer that same day. Sit with it overnight. Read it back once out loud before your coffee the next morning. If it still sounds like love in daylight, say yes. If it sounds like a bill wearing love's clothing, say no, kindly, plainly, and only once. If this story moved you, hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what part hit you hardest. I put everything into these stories for you, and I'll see you in the next one.